everybody, my name is Paper Pauper Player, and today we are going to be unboxing Rakdos Goblin Combo, or better known as Moggwarts. If you guys have seen my Walls Combo video, this deck is very similar in the sense that it makes infinite mana and it tries to use that mana to burn out your opponent. If you're interested in this deck, the list will be down in the description below, and while you're down there, press the subscribe button. In the next few weeks, we're going to also be opening up Blue-Black Terror, and then I also just started a new series on the channel called Paper Pauper Playing, where my friend and I played Paper Pauper. The first episode's already out, where I was playing Orzhov Ephemerate and my friend was playing Walls Combo, and you should check it out because it's a really good video. As per usual, we'll be sleeving our cards in our Dragon Shield matte sleeves and keeping our cards in our Ultimate Guard Boulder deck box. Packing peanut time! So I saw this deck when I first started playing Pauper, and I was like, man, whatever, this deck looks kind of mid, I don't really care about it. But for some reason, for the past month, this is a deck I've been wanting to play like the most. For some reason, this is the most excited I've been to open a deck in a long time, and I don't know why, because red is usually not my color. We're also going to be starting this video a little bit differently by just flat out explaining what the combo is before actually getting into the deck itself. Unlike Walls Combo, which is really versatile and flexible in the ways that it's able to go infinite, this deck is extremely linear in the fact that it needs these three cards in order to pop off. So let's start off by introducing the three combo cards, starting off with Skirk Prospector, which is a 1/1 goblin creature that costs 1 red mana that says sacrifice a goblin, add 1 red mana to your mana pool. This ability to sacrifice a goblin and add 1 red mana to your mana pool can be done at any time at instant speed. So you can activate it in response to your opponent's playing cards, and this is going to be our main engine to the deck. Next up, we have 4 copies of Putrid Goblin, which is a 2/2 creature that costs 2 mana, a black and a colorless, and it has Persist, which says when this creature dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, you can return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. What this means is that because Putrid Goblin is a 2/2, when it dies, it comes back onto the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter, making it a 1/1. So the final card of this combo is First Day of Class, which is a 2 mana instant, a red and a colorless. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains haste until end of turn. First Day of Class also has a keyword Learn, which means you can reveal a lesson card you own from outside the game and put it into your hand, or discard a card to draw a card. The main effect of the card that adds a +1/+1 counters is what we use for our combo, and the Learn effect says you may, so you don't have to include lessons in your deck if you don't want to. But if you do want to use the Learn ability of this card, outside of the game means in your sideboard. So in the sideboard of this deck, we're running 2 copies of Introduction to Prophecy, which is a 3 mana sorcery lesson that allows you to scry 2, then draw a card. So Introduction to Prophecy does take up 2 slots in your sideboard, but they don't have to if you don't want them to. But let's go ahead and now talk about how this combo works. In order to understand how this combo works, you have to understand how counters work in Magic the Gathering. Now in Magic, you have positive counters, which will represent with this white die, and then you have negative counters, which will represent with this black die. Opposing counters on creatures in Magic cancel each other out. If Skirk Prospector has 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and then it gains a -1/-1 counter, then Skirk Prospector basically just goes down to a +1/+1 counter. You basically just take the sum of whatever your +X counters are and your -X counters are and come up with a set value. So you have both Skirk Prospector and Putrid Goblin on the field, and you decide to cast First Day of Class. When a creature enters the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains haste until end of turn. So this is an effect that lasts the rest of your turn. So we're gonna go ahead and tuck this text box up here so that you can see it, because that's for the rest of the turn. And now we can combo off. So what we could do is we could take Skirk Prospector and sacrifice a goblin to add 1 red mana to our mana pool. We sacrifice Putrid Goblin, gain our 1 red mana, and because of Putrid Goblin's Persist ability, it's gonna re-enter the battlefield with a -1 counter on it. With that being said, First Day of Class's effect is still active. So not only is Putrid Goblin gonna enter with its -1 counter, but it's also going to enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. So because Putrid Goblin has both a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter, they actually both just go away, and now he has no counters. And now you could do this infinitely, because you can activate Skirk Prospector's ability again, kill Putrid Goblin, gain another red mana. Putrid Goblin comes back with both a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter. Those cancel each other out. Now you can activate Skirk Prospector's ability again, sacrifice him, get another red mana. He comes back, gets both the +1/+1 and -1/-1 counters. They cancel each other out, and you can now make infinite red mana. And that is the Goblin Combo. So now let's go ahead and talk about what we can do with our infinite mana. Starting off with 2 copies of Makeshift Munitions, which is a 2 mana enchantment, a red and colorless, that says you can pay 1 mana, sacrifice an artifact or a creature, and Makeshift Munitions will deal 1 damage to any target. So now that you've made infinite mana with Skirk Prospector, you could spend 2 of that infinite mana to play Makeshift Munitions. You could pay 1 of your infinite mana to sacrifice Putrid Goblin to Makeshift Munitions, deal 1 damage to your opponent, Putrid Goblin will re-enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter, cancel each other out, and it's the same exact loop that you just did with Skirk Prospector, except now you're killing your opponent. So we're running 2 copies of Makeshift Munitions, and we're running 1 copy of Flame Wave Invoker, which is a 2/2 goblin creature that costs 3 mana, a red and 2 colorless, and for 8 mana, a red and 7 colorless, Flame Wave Invoker can deal 5 damage to target player. 8 mana is an absurd cost to deal 5 damage to your opponent, but when you have infinite mana, who cares? Having infinite mana with Flame Wave Invoker on the field is the closest I'll ever be to experiencing what it must feel like to be in the top 1% of billionaires in the United States. So next up, we have 1 copy of Dark Dweller Oracle, which is a 2/2 goblin that costs 2 mana, a red and a colorless that says, pay 1 mana, sacrifice a creature, exile a top card of your library, you may play that card this turn. So just like Makeshift Munitions, when you have your infinite mana, you can use Dark Dweller Oracle to sacrifice Putrid Goblin infinitely to exile all of the cards from your library, and then you could play all of those cards on this turn. This card is technically both a combo piece and not a combo piece, and it's also technically a win con and not a win con, because you can combo off and win without it, but you can also combo off and win with it. Now, it should be pretty obvious why Dark Dweller Oracle and Flame Wave Invoker are in the deck, and you could be thinking to yourself, well, why don't you just play 4 copies of Makeshift Munitions? Because both of these are goblins, and we have 4 copies of Goblin Matron, which is a 1/1 goblin that costs 3 mana, a red and 2 colorless that says, when Goblin Matron enters a battlefield, you may search your library for a goblin card, reveal that card, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. So when you make your infinite mana, if you don't have your win conditions in your deck, you can use Goblin Matron to go fetch your Dark Dweller Oracle or your Flame Wave Invoker to win the game. Goblins are personally not my thing. I prefer satyrs, merfolk, spirits, elves, slivers, pretty much all of those. I don't really like goblins, but this is like one of my favorite magic arts. I love this art, especially compared to the original Goblin Matron art, which, Jesus Christ, that motherfucker looks like the fortune teller from Foster's Home of Imaginary Friends. That was such a specific reference. So next up, we have 1 copy of this green card, Masked Vandal, which is a 1/3 creature that costs 2 mana, a green and a colorless. That's a changeling, which means it's every creature type, so Masked Vandal is a goblin, and when Masked Vandal enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. If our opponent has a main board enchantment or artifact that really hurts us, we can use Goblin Matron to fetch Masked Vandal so that we can deal with it. Just to be clear, we have no green lands in this deck, but we have plenty of ways of making green mana with cards like Deadly Dispute, which we have 4 copies of. Deadly Dispute is a 2 mana instant, a black and a colorless that says, as an additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature, draw 2 cards and create a treasure token that says, tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color. So the treasure tokens are a little important in this deck because Skirk Prospector can only make infinite red mana. So if we're going through our deck and we run into a black card that we need to cast, we need to be able to have the black mana to do that. So the treasure tokens are there to help us out, and on top of that, Deadly Dispute is also just a really good card because it draws us 2 cards, which is great value. And just as a quick note about Deadly Dispute, it says here, as an additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice an artifact or a creature. So when you cast Deadly Dispute, you have to sacrifice an artifact or a creature as you're casting it, not when it's in the middle of resolving. If your opponent decides they want to counter the Deadly Dispute, you still have to sacrifice that artifact or creature because it was a part of the casting costs of the card. So we're running 4 copies of Deadly Dispute and 4 copies of Unearth, which is a 1 black mana sorcery. Choose target creature card in your graveyard that costs 3 mana or less and put that creature into play. This also has Cycling 2, which means you can pay 2 mana and discard this card from your hand to draw a card. So next up, we have 1 copy of Shred Memory, which is a 2 mana instant, a black and a colorless. Remove up to 4 target cards in a single graveyard from the game. It also has Transmute for 3 mana, 2 black and a colorless. You can discard this card, search your library for a card with the same converted mana cost as this card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. Play only as a sorcery. So not only is this card unironically good against graveyard decks like Blue-Black Terror if you just so happen to run into them, but the Transmute allows us to go get any of our combo pieces. It allows us to go get our Putrid Goblin, our First Day of Class, our Makeshift Munitions. This is just a really good tutor card to help us find whatever piece we're missing in our hand. So next up, we have 1 copy of Smash to Dust, which is a 2 mana sorcery, a red and a colorless. Choose 1, destroy target artifact, destroy target creature with Defender, or Smash to Dust deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. So this is our board wipe for decks that play a bunch of 1/1s like Godolphin Rebirth, Mono Blue Fairies, Cog Gates. It just allows us to deal 1 damage to clean the board. And this card is your edge against Walls combo because it destroys a target creature with Defender, so you can use it against one of your opponent's key combo pieces. And that's why we're also running 3 copies in Sideboard. So next up, we're running 2 copies of Duress, which is a 1 black mana sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. Just a little card that allows us to look into our opponent's hand so that we know when it's safe to actually combo off. And that way we can also take out any counter spells so our opponent can't counter our first day of class or counter anything that will prevent us from winning the game. So next up we have Urborg Repossession, which is a 1 black mana sorcery, but we can also cast it for 3 mana, a black, a forest, and a colorless to kick the spell. Kicker cards in Magic usually have an effect, but then they have an additional effect that you can get by basically paying the extra mana. In this case, Urborg Repossession says return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, you gain 2 life, and if the spell is kicked, return another target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So for 1 black mana, you can return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand and you gain 2 life, but for 3 mana, not only can you return that creature card from your graveyard to your hand, but then you can also return another permanent card in your graveyard to your hand. So if your opponent gets rid of your makeshift munitions, you can use this card to return that to your hand. So next up, we have 3 copies of Chromatic Star, which is a 1 mana artifact that says you can pay 1 mana, tap it, sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and then when Chromatic Star is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you can draw a card. So the cool thing about Chromatic Star is you could sacrifice it with makeshift munitions or deadly dispute and you still get to draw a card. Chromatic Star's counterpart, Chromatic Sphere, only draws you a card when it sacrifices itself, but Chromatic Star draws a card anytime it enters a graveyard from the battlefield. Next up, we have 4 copies of Ichor Wellspring, which is a 2 mana artifact. When Ichor Wellspring enters the battlefield or is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Same thing as Chromatic Star, when you sacrifice this with deadly dispute, you get to draw 3 cards, but this has an additional benefit of drawing you a card when you play it, which is really nice. And next up is 1 copy of Energy Refractor, which is a 2 mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card, and then for 2 mana, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Now, the Energy Refractor is my doing. Technically, this deck is supposed to run 4 Chromatic Stars, but I thought Energy Refractor was really good in this deck because you're making infinite red mana, and so you could filter it for black at any point, and when there's a battlefield, you draw a card, and you could still sacrifice it if you want if it's not doing anything for you. I just thought it was a good inclusion to the deck. Alright, so let's go and get into the land, starting off with our 2 copies of Rakdos Carnarium. Rakdos card comes into play tapped, and when Rakdos card comes into play, you return a land you control to its owner's hand. So this is what's known as a bounce land, and the bounce lands are really good because they tap for 2 colors of mana at once. So unlike Drossforge Bridge, which can only tap for either a black or a red, when you tap Rakdos card, you create a black and a red, so it taps for 2 mana. With that being said, when you start a game of Magic and you draw your 7 cards, if Rakdos card is the only land in your hand, you have to mulligan. The reason being is because when you play a bounce land, if there's no other lands on the battlefield, then the bounce land has to bounce itself. So the bounce land goes back into your hand, and now it's like you didn't play a land for turn. So although it's really good, there's a reason why we're only playing 2 copies, because we don't want to see it in our starting hand a lot because it just is kind of rough. We kind of want to see it in the middle of the game. So next up, we have 4 copies of Drossforge Bridge, which is our indestructible artifact land. It enters the battlefield tap, but it can't be destroyed, and if you really need to, you could sacrifice it to makeshift munitions and deadly dispute. Next up, we have 2 copies of Tramway Station, which enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap for either a black or a red, and then you could pay 4 mana, a black, a red, and 2 colorless, to sacrifice Tramway Station to draw a card. So in the middle of the game, if you need to draw a card and you have your infinite mana, you can then sacrifice this to draw a card. So next up, we have 1 copy of Bajuka Bog, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to exile all cards from target player's graveyard. And then finally, we're running 4 basic swamps and 5 basic mountains. I love this art because this is the exact landscape that everybody builds their first Minecraft house in. Anyone who's ever played Minecraft for the very first time cuts down all 3 of these trees, uses the wood to make a pickaxe, and just starts digging holes into this mountain right here, easily. Tell me in the comments below if this mountain is your first Minecraft house. Alright, so let's go and get into the sideboard, starting off with our 2 copies of Introduction to Prophecy. We already talked about this. It's basically just preordained for 3 mana. Like I mentioned, you don't have to play these in your sideboard. You get to choose if you want to use the Learn effect on cards like First Day of Class. If you feel like for the rest of your life, every time you play First Day of Class, you're never gonna use the Learn ability, then you can replace these with like Pyroblast or Red Elemental Blast. So next up, we have those 3 additional copies of Smash to Dust, and then we have 2 additional copies of Duress. So next up, we have 2 copies of Nihil Spellbomb, which is a 1 mana artifact. Tap it, sacrifice Nihil Spellbomb, exile all cards from target player's graveyard, and when Nihil Spellbomb is put in the graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay black mana. If you do, draw a card. Have I ever mentioned how much I hate talking about Gorilla Shaman on the show because I feel like explaining how this works is really complicated? So next up, we have 2 copies of Gorilla Shaman, which is a 1/1 creature that costs 1 red mana, and for 1 mana and 2 X mana, you could destroy target non-creature artifact with mana value X. What this means is you have to pay 1 regular mana, and then whatever the converted mana cost of the non-creature artifact that you're trying to blow up is, you need to pay double the mana in order to blow it up. So just for example purposes, let's say your opponent has an Ichor Wellspring that you want to blow up, which I don't know why you would want to do that because then they would be able to draw a card. But Ichor Wellspring's mana cost is 2, so Gorilla Shaman's X value is 2. So you would do X equals 2 plus X equals 2 plus 1, which equals 5, so you'd be spending 5 mana to basically allow your opponent to draw a card, which is f***ing stupid. Okay, so I know that seems bad, but the real reason why Gorilla Shaman is in this deck is because of artifact lands. The great thing about lands in Magic is that their converted mana cost is 0 because they're free to play. The awful part about people playing artifact lands against Gorilla Shaman is that X equals 0. 1 mana in a deck that makes infinite mana, you can blow up all of your opponent's artifact lands, except for your opponent's indestructible artifact lands, but I digress. Anyways, we're running 2 copies of Gorilla Shaman and 3 copies of Abrade, which is a 2 mana instant, a red and a colorless. Choose one, Abrade deals 3 damage to target creature, or destroy target artifact. I'll be honest, these are basically just additional copies of Smash the Dust. And then finally, we have 1 copy of Croc Clan Shaman, which is a 1/1 goblin creature that costs 1 red mana, sacrifice an artifact. Croc Clan Shaman deals 1 damage to each creature without flying. Croc Clan Shaman is a fantastic card to bring in against those decks that are playing a bunch of 1/1s, because we can play Croc Clan Shaman, play our Eager Wellspring or our Chromatic Star, sacrifice it, wipe their entire board, draw a card. It's just a fantastic card. So that is going to be Rakdos Goblin Combo in Pauper. I'm extremely excited for this deck. I'm usually not a combo player, and I love Walls Combo, but there's just something about this deck. I just love the consistency of it, and I'm just really excited to give it a shot during Paper Pauper playing, which you guys can check out the playlist down below for that. And like I said, the deck list is down there as well. While you're down there checking out the content, please press subscribe button. It helps support the channel, lets me know that you're enjoying what I'm doing. And I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.